You are entering the Nillyverse with your hosts Gustavo Candia and Rodney Parrott. This episode has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. No.
So good morning, Gustavo.
Morning, Rodney.
So today we're entering into a really interesting area, I think, because we come to the section 6 of our book. All the work that we've done up through this last almost 200 pages now, we are now going to start using it, critiquing the popularizers of science. So we've done a lot of hard work, and now we're going to see how it can be applied. This first subsection is just about the popularizers of science and what we call scientism that's developing. And you'll see what that is as we go along. But I was thinking this morning as I was looking at this, I really would recommend that our listeners read the book. Some of the things that are said, you really need a kind of argument, 1, 2, 3, 4 statements in a row built on one another. And we can highlight them and so forth, and it's kind of fun actually to highlight them, but it'd be nice if everybody read it. So I recommend people read the book.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance there that is missed with just highlighting this most salient sort of points of the section. Did you have something that you wanted to introduce?
I'll go a little bit of just to give people a sense of who the popularizers are.
That's a good introduction, yeah. We keep talking about the popularizers.
You know, we've affectionately called them the pops as we've gotten to know them over our time. And so it really shows that we have a kind of both critical but affectionate relationship to them, the pops. So who are these popularizers? Just in terms of some names, some of the most famous ones, Brian Greene wrote a book called The Elegant Universe. Michio Kaku, who we will look at a little bit today, he is everywhere, ubiquitous on any of the visual media around the country. He wrote a book called The Physics of the Impossible and a lot of other books, but he's a great character. Lawrence Krauss, of course, who we've talked about before, Universe from Nothing. Max Tegmark, who's a really interesting fellow who wrote a book about the universe having a sort of mathematical basis as its base. Frank Wilczek, we've talked about before, who I like very much, and he basically points out the fact that the universe is a thing of beauty, not a thing of mathematics, but a thing of beauty, which is interesting. And we talk about later in the book about how cosmologists, physicists, and so forth are looking for one unified notion of what the universe is. Mark came up with math, and Wilczek came up with beauty. And then there's some others. Neil deGrasse Tyson, he wrote this great book called Death by Black Hole. And Lisa Randall is probably the most prominent woman among our group of pops. She wrote a book called Warped Passages. She's interesting. She's out here at MIT, I think. And then, of course, Stephen Hawking, A Brief History of Time, and so forth. These people, it's important to note that they are ultimately important influencers, as we say today, of what the culture thinks life is about. These popularizers of science are determining the myths and images and cultural beliefs of the whole Western world now. So we have to look at them seriously. So it's good that we are doing this as a critique, because we don't want this to happenstance and so forth. So one thing that's kind of interesting, and we're going to talk about scientism and so forth, and later on we talk about how the popularizers of science are sort of becoming the new religious leaders of the world. Establishing the myths is one of the ways you do that. There's a very common thing that happens in the introduction or the first chapter of our books, of our pops' books, is that they will talk about their lineage. Just very reminiscent of all the begats of the Old Testament, you know what I mean, of the Christian Old Testament. And it always goes through Carl Sagan to Richard Feynman back to Einstein.
Always back to Einstein.
Beginning. And the atom of modern mythology.
Science.
Einstein. The one thing to see about how really important these books are that the popularizers are writing, let's just take a look. Carl Sagan's Cosmos is often thought of it's one of the earliest of this sort of theme. Back in 1980, it was 70 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It was the first science book that's ever been on the New York Times seller list like that. 70 weeks on New York Times bestseller list. It was voted one of the 88 greatest books in American history and so forth. Hawking's Brief History of Time, on the English equivalent of the New York Times bestseller list, 237 weeks on the London Sunday Times bestseller, almost 237 weeks. And just when I was in the midst of looking at this section, I remember when we were writing it, I looked on Amazon to see what was bestsellers on Amazon. It was a Pops book, deGrasse Tyson, Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. And 217 was the bestseller on Amazon. So these books are very, very important and influential. I say that they are the canon of science for literary people, for literate people. In a certain sense, they have become the scriptures of the modern Western world. I mean, before we get too carried away, we should really mention that the Bible is still by far the most widely read book in the world. I think 100 million copies a year are put out. There's an interesting thing about the Bible that I never realized. You know, the Bible is not only a book to read, but it is a piece of iconography unto itself. It's an important book to have, to hold, and to look at, not just to read. And I read this thing, and it's pretty interesting that the average American household has 4.4 Bibles in it.
That's incredible.
I thought that was interesting. So not to get too carried away with the popularity of our pops, but they definitely are influential, but they aren't as read as the Bible, nor are they as read as the quotations from Chairman Mao, which is interesting. There's many more of the little red book read in the world.
Another little point is that it's not just that they're reaching out to just the literate masses, but they're also reaching out to children. I mean, you mentioned Neil deGrasse Tyson. His approach is, listen, let's start young, because this is where we have the best chance of keeping them with our mythos.
Hawking joined up with his wife and wrote a whole series of kids. Who was it? George the Storyteller. I can't remember. I read a few of them. They were pretty interesting, about AI robots traveling through the universe and so forth, all written for children.
Popularizers would say like that you should be able to distill the science so that it's comprehensible for a 12-year-old. And if you can't do that, then you don't really know your science well enough. A good exercise. And it can be an incredibly valuable thing for society to have this done. But what we're shooting for, I think, is for it to be done in an honest and open way, right? In a way that keeps children sort of wondering and not just locked. Yeah, I'm going to speak the real and say that all that is real is what can be seen, touched, tasted, smelled, and heard, essentially.
Yeah. And as we saw, we've talked about in the past, there's a real admiration for children's perspective on things in terms of creativity coming from the physicists themselves.
Yeah.
So there's one more aspect of sort of looking at the impact, I just go through quickly, of the popularizers, and that is really starting in 2005 when YouTube came into the world, a whole new explosion of ways that you can hear the popularizers' teachings and perspectives came to us. And we are so enamored with YouTube now. During the time that we were writing our book, it went from the third most popular search engine to the second most popular search engine on the whole internet.
People don't want to read anymore. They want the video to explain it to them.
That's right. Reading is way too slow.
Helps the popularizers sort of, I guess, goal to illustrate science, to make it more pictorial, use these trans heuristics to serve their means, but without acknowledging what they're doing.
Without acknowledging what they're doing is as we're getting into our critique now, is really an unpopular, I mean, that's an important thing to remember, without acknowledging what they're doing. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along today. But later on, we'll see that faith is very active in the world of popularizers of science and is never acknowledged as being true. I just wanted to mention that in terms of the impact of the popularizers, YouTube now will carry TED Talks and academic conference lectures, interviews, and of course, with the growth of popularity of podcasts and Zoomcasts and so forth, the popularizers are everywhere. And it's not unusual. For instance, I was just looking at some numbers, and Lawrence Krauss did a discussion of his latest book, 250,000 views as when I looked. Michio Kaku's latest book, 710,000 views. And as I've been looking through, especially the more interview-based YouTubes, it's not unusual at all for 1.2 million people to have viewed these discussions by popularizers. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, if you look at kind of these very esoteric discussions about, you know, the Big Bang or the Higgs field, or these very, very rarefied discussions, and you've got 1.1 million people looking at them.
That's a lot of influence.
It's an amazing amount of influence by a totally new form of understanding, and this is the popularizers of science. So let's just point out one thing, and then we'll move on to scientism that we talked about, what scientism is. But one thing that's very important, and this is essential. Now, all these scientists, they're academics. They have positions. All the big universities throughout the United States and Canada and Europe, these are not people who just write for the popular audiences. They're also talking within their own colleagues. And these are some of the most influential academics there are in the whole world within the realm of academia. But one thing that happened when the popularizers went out to the world of the literate reader, as I talked about, is they eschewed mathematics. The essential thing to remember, they consciously rid their books of any math. There's hardly any equation. Sometimes there's a reference to some of the more simple equations in the books, but the explanatory quality of mathematics is missing. Now, this is very important because within the realm of physics, the most important language physicists talk to one another is math. So if you get rid of math, you have, in effect, the popularizers going out into the world of images and language. And so what they've actually done is created a whole new genre of literature on the basis of these popularizer presentations. What has happened is the popularizers have, I think in a kind of backward way, I don't think they would have planned it this way, they have forced themselves to become storytellers. And the fact is, they're not very good storytellers. That's one of the problems.
They weren't trained in it, no.
They weren't trained as storytellers, but now they have to try to explain their main ideas with words and images. And they know that they're storytellers. For instance, Krauss's latest book is called The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far. And of course, that's a reference to a famous movie about the Bible, and the greatest story is, of course, about the life of Christ. He says this, I'm not saying in the story that I have told today that the universe came from nothing. We can give a plausible mechanism for the universe of something coming from nothing without divine intervention. God is unnecessary, or at best redundant. You notice that he introduced that by saying, you know that story that I've just told you?
Right.
It's about God being redundant. So here's another, one more, and then we'll move on again. But Brian Greene wrote this really good book called The Elegant Universe. And I've been watching some presentations of Brian Greene. He's a very, very good speaker. He's very clear in his message. He believes that the physical universe, he loves the laws of the universe, but the physical universe is elegant, and he says it is the greatest fodder for telling stories. And he says this, we all love a good story. We all love a tantalizing mystery. We all love the underdog pressing onward against seemingly insurmountable odds. That's the way he's describing physics. He's not talking about a love story or an adventure or a James Bond film. He's talking about physics. He's talking about cosmology. And he's talking about it as if it's a
Rocky film.
as if it's a tale about Rocky, yeah. And that's really interesting to me. While maintaining that it's science, they're saying that we're telling great stories. So what we're talking about there is that the popularizers of science have made amazing use of the visual forms of communication as typified by YouTube, and they've become storytellers. My sense is that they're not very good at YouTube, and they're not very good at storytelling, but that's what they've taken on in their role, because that's how you influence the culture mostly. So that's just an introduction to who the popularizers are and so forth. So maybe you can talk about what that means and what this term scientism is about.
Yeah, so let me start then with a couple quotations from some of the books I think that you've mentioned and others that you might have missed. But like example of scientism, right? And let's work backwards from those quotations and pull out what's being said. The first one is from Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and it goes, the cosmos is all that there is, or all ever was, or ever will be. Then there's another one from Steven Weinberg, another popularizer. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless.
Yes.
Hugo Wilson, this one's a good one here. We can be proud as a species because, having discovered that we are alone, we owe the gods very little. Let's take those quotations and kind of refresh ourselves, I guess, what science is. Well, science is an activity that seeks to explore the natural world using well-established, clearly delineated methods, which again we'll review in the Hop on Pop section, what those methods are. But given the complexity of the universe, from the very big to the small and the organic to the inorganic, there's a vast array of disciplines, each with their own questions and techniques The number of these specializations is constantly increasing, leading to more questions and areas of exploration than ever before. So science then expands our understanding rather than limiting it. I think we all love that science. That's great science. Scientism, on the other hand, is a worldview about the ultimate reality of the universe and its meaning, and focusing an inordinate amount of attention on human behavior and beliefs. A person that holds to scientism, or this worldview, thinks that we can fully explain the natural world strictly by natural means without appealing to God. Pressed, such a scientist would say that he has no need for religion or theology, in that all that is real is what is natural. And this is an important thing that we've mentioned before about the real, that the natural speaks exhaustively of what is real. This certainly begs the question, but it also disregards the history of science, where glorification of God was the prime motivator for these natural philosophers. It is like their reason for doing science. So let me pull out a couple of quotations, one from Galileo and one from Kepler from our book here. The first one from Galileo: "The greatness and the glory of God shines forth marvelously in all his works, and is to be read above all in the open book of the heavens." And then a couple of years later, by Kepler, "I feel carried away and possessed by an unutterable rapture over the divine spectacle of the heavenly harmony. God himself was too kind to remain idle, and began to play the game of signatures, signing his likeness into the world." Scientism restricts human inquiry in that it denies the possibility that our motivation behind doing science cannot add anything meaningful to our understanding of the natural universe, despite the most common quantum mechanical interpretations of the effect consciousness has on the natural universe. So let's forget about that, right?
Yeah.
But it's odd, right? One thing to celebrate science for its achievements and a remarkable ability to explain a wide variety of phenomena in the natural world, but to claim that there's nothing knowable outside of the scope of science, this is a good one, would be similar to a successful fisherman saying that whatever he can't catch in his nets does not exist.
Does not exist.
Once you accept that science is the only source of human knowledge, you've adopted a philosophical position, i.e. scientism, that cannot be verified or falsified by science itself. And so, in that sense, it is unscientific. Let's wrap it all up. How should we define scientism? How about something like this? Scientism is a matter of putting too high a value on natural science in comparison with other branches of learning and culture, where, taken to the extreme, science is the only source of real knowledge.
That's where we talk about the hubris of science.
Yeah, exactly.
There was something I can't remember exactly. I didn't look back into this, but about an interpretation of when Einstein first started being popular with this relativity general and special. There's been interpretations that people were sort of relieved because they'd never understand science. It gives them something to believe in.
Yeah, that's right.
You gave a really nice illustration there from the viewpoint of the scientist. That is scientism. I hadn't actually thought about it in that way. And so that's something new, something added to the book, which is really good from their viewpoint as opposed to the reader's viewpoint.
Right.
I have one more little stat here, but it's getting a little bit long. Maybe we ought to go to Hop on Pops and come back as we need to.
All right, that sounds good. That sounds good. As you mentioned before, our pop for this week is Mikio Kaku. We visited him before. He's, like Rodney said, everywhere in science. And what he believes ultimately is important because he has so much influence. So we want to know what it is that he believes, despite wanting all scientists, or most people, I guess, in general, wanting to hold those cards close to his chest. We can sort of get a sense of what that is by watching this video. So let's do that here. Let me share. Okay, here we are.
There it is.
When you talk about religion, I like to quote from Galileo. Galileo said, "The purpose of science is to determine how the heavens go. The purpose of religion is to determine how to go to heaven." So in other words, science is about natural law. It's about the laws of nature. while religion is about ethics, about how to go to heaven, how to be a good person, how to earn the favor of God. So you see, as long as you keep these two separate, there's no problem at all. The problem occurs when people from the natural sciences begin to pontificate about ethics, and when religious people begin to pontificate about natural law. That's where we get into trouble. Now, at the boundary of the two, the question arises, can you prove the existence of God? Well, first of all, let's be clear about this. There are two kinds of God. Einstein was very clear about this. Two kinds of God. The first God is a personal God, the God that you pray to, the God that gives you your bicycle for Christmas, the God that smites the Philistines and destroys your enemies. That's the personal God. Einstein did not believe that the God of the universe created us just so you can get that wagon for a Christmas present. You see, Einstein believed in another God, the God of Spinoza, the God of Leibniz, the God of order, harmony. The universe could have been random. It could have been chaotic. It could have been messy. But the universe is actually quite elegant, quite simple, and in fact is gorgeous. You can put the laws of physics as we know them on a simple sheet of paper. Amazing. Didn't have to be that way. Therefore, you ask the question, is the existence of God provable? Well, what is science? Science is based on things that are testable, reproducible, and falsifiable. But you see, the existence of God is not testable. It's not reproducible. You cannot reproduce God at will. You cannot put an angel inside a box and demand that miracles take place. It doesn't work that way. That's why religion is based on faith, rather than things that are objectively testable, falsifiable, and reproducible. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. I don't know. I don't know if God exists or not. All I'm saying is that science is limited by looking at what is testable, reproducible, and falsifiable. There are areas where you push the boundaries of that, like the Big Bang. You cannot reproduce the Big Bang. You cannot test the Big Bang. It's like a detective story. You can only look at the clues left over from the Big Bang. So to calculate the instant of creation is in some sense outside science, because it's not reproducible. You cannot reproduce the Big Bang. But you can then trace the history of what happened afterwards, like a murder mystery, and that's where a lot of science is done. And that's why I say that the existence of God is not within the normal boundaries of science.
All right. A lot of what he said is I don't think that we would disagree with. I mean, let's just sort of go through, let's just parse what he just said in those three and a half minutes or so. He first mentions Galileo, this idea that science answers how the heavens go, whereas religion answers how to go to heaven. Right? It's a bit of a reduction, what Kaku sort of offers there, but I don't totally disagree with that. There should be no problem if people stay within the domain of their expertise, essentially. The reason why you might have had religious people in the past chime in on the natural laws is because there was no real science or consensus about science in the past. So there was a gap, and people had these questions, and they looked to authority to sort of help them with that. Okay, granted, the priests that were being asked weren't involved in any sort of scientific inquiry, and so they looked inside, looked to their beliefs, and said something that ultimately turned out to be preposterous, not consistent with nature, if you just know where to look. But that's not so much what is happening today. I don't think that any learned priest would refer to the Bible, right, to be able to describe celestial motion. So again, if what Kaku is trying to do is straw man religion, and I don't think that he did that here in this video, but for those that do, I don't think that that's the reality of today, that many respected religious people are talking or pontificating about the natural laws, what the Bible has to say about the natural laws. I don't think that too many learned religious people are speaking to that, unless they are familiar with the science and are quoting from science. So for now, we're okay. I do have a disagreement with how he presents the two gods. I don't disagree with the fact that there are, in a way, two ways to see God. One being the personal or theistic God, and the second one being the deistic God. I disagree with how he kind of throws the theistic God under the bus, or labels it as the one that you pray to get Christmas presents for. Right? Yeah. I want a wagon, so I'm going to pray to my theistic God. And that's the only kind of relationship that you could have with a personal God. One of like sort of, I want and you will give me. That's a rather childish way to conceive of theism. But that's how he sees it. But it's obvious that by the sound of what he's saying, that Kaku is actually very open to being open to the possibility of there being a deistic God. The God of order, he says, of Spinoza, of Einstein, ... of smart people like me, right? That's what he's saying. God of order, Spinoza, Einstein, you know these guys, they're smart guys, right? You can believe in these guys. I'm like them. I believe like them. So you're okay. Just follow along with me. He talks about like the laws of nature being gorgeous. And you have a ton to say about this. The idea of beauty and awe being unacknowledged by many of these pops. It's acknowledged here, but dive deeper into it. What is that? What gives you that feeling of beauty and awe, right? And we have a lot more to say on that. He talks about science being testable, reproducible, falsifiable. Excellent. We, again, totally agree. The existence of God is not scientific. But this doesn't mean, going back to the point that I keep highlighting or underscoring, doesn't mean that it's less real as a result of that. Just because it's not scientific does not make it less real. Scientists is limited by these conditions of being testable, reproducible, falsifiable. Those are not the conditions, the only conditions that need to be met to satisfy whether something is real or not. A very good point that he ends off with, gives us hope, gives Rodney and I hope, is that the instant of creation is outside science. That's a good spot of humility on his part. Maybe some scientists, Kaku feels, are overstepping a little bit.
Yes.
He gives that little hint. Yeah, I'll give him a little bit of respect there. Is there anything else that you might have caught that I missed?
No, that's really good. I watched a lot of Kaku over the last couple years. He talks about the fact that he was born in a family where one parent was a Buddhist and one parent was a Catholic. And so he talks a little bit about that. And so in a certain sense, I think he steps on his own feet a few times in this. He tries really hard to be open to a lot of things. But he didn't make any sort of offhanded jokes about pantheism. He made offhand jokes about theism, the God you pray to. So in a certain sense, he says, well, in the end, I don't really know. But if you're silly enough to pray for a sled for Christmas, then you probably don't know what you're doing anyway. He uses that particular image at least in 3 different discussions about praying for, is it sled? I can't remember, praying for something for Christmas.
Yeah, I think so, sled.
I can't remember what, a wagon.
A wagon.
A wagon. Yeah, so in a certain sense, he does undercut himself. He says when physicists are talking about ethics, they're out of their realm. But then in his attitudes toward prayer and personal God are, in fact, a physicist stepping out of his realm. So he just steps right out of the very realm that he says he doesn't want to do. And he also takes for granted that Einstein is a good basis for religion.
Appeal to authority.
And thought so that it was...
By appeal to authority, I mean that don't use that as a basis for logical argument or for
no,
an art. It's not.
Absolutely not.
Especially not for a scientist.
Well, Lawrence Krauss does exactly the same thing. Because Krauss was confronted with a question from a young boy, as you remember. I think we played it. A young boy asked him the question.
That's right.
You know, Einstein said that without religion, science is lost, and without science, religion is something. I can't remember what. And he puts him off by saying, yeah, but Einstein only believed in the God of Spinoza. So this is a common thing. But nonetheless, Einstein said that he was a pantheist and allowed for the imbuement of God throughout the world, which created the beauty of the laws and so forth. So in a certain sense, when Kaku and others say they go to Einstein and Spinoza hoping that that means something and nobody's going to go beyond that, he's really calling on the elders, just like you mentioned.
Remember, like at least my problem with pantheism is that, okay, that's great and all, but there is no beyond. So if God is everything that there is, what if that is not? Or what if that is beyond, essentially? Yeah. We need a God to fill that gap that gap that will forever be. There will always be a beyond what is. So that's why the pantheist God falls short for me.
Very interesting. Good stuff. I'm glad we looked at this because these YouTube videos are so important now. Amazing what we can see on the internet.
And scientism is a trap. It's a trap that a lot of people they're going to be drawn to it because people are looking for certainty. Mm-hmm. And scientism, I think paradoxically, it's trying to do. It's like you don't have to believe in anything, just believe in the natural world, and that's it. You can confidently say, well, we don't know that. We don't know that, right? But it's more than just about we don't know that. It's openly accepting that there's something beyond what I know or don't know, right? That's what the point is, right? Like go further than that and just letting it go from your mind and just concentrating on what can be known now. Devote some time to the beyond. It'll pay off.
Very good. Scientism. That should be a new thing for a lot of our listeners. Even think that science could be something to believe in.
An ism. I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to be part of any group. What's the Groucho Marx expression? I don't want to be part of any group that would accept me as one of its members.
Right. That's right. So.
All right. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Entering the Universe has been brought to you by the Society of Namecoin. Until next time, no.